Welcome to the Life's Best Medicine podcast, where we are finding hope and healing one episode at a time. No appointment needed, no rubber gloves, and no coping. Just a healthy dose of life lessons to help equip you for this wild journey we call life. Hey everyone. Yes, it's July, another month down. We made it through half the year. Now we're starting the second half. Yes, Christmas is coming up and holiday. So let's get in shape this summer. Simply Snacking, who's bringing these episodes to you, is a great choice. So they have great flavors of beef and chicken, and they're individually wrapped, so you could just throw them in your purse or in your car or wherever you need to be. So it's a go-to. I'm actually out and I have to order some more, but you can order and get it. So thank you for supporting the podcast and Simply Snacking. They're getting busy too, so that's good news. All right, take care. Bye-bye. Hey everyone, this is a friendly reminder that we are here for entertainment purposes only. We may not even be that entertaining at times, but this is not medical advice. Talk to your doctor, check with your healthcare professionals before making any lifestyle changes or medicine changes. What we're talking about is our clinical experience and what we've seen. And so if you really want our advice, you can consult us. You can actually consult me as a doctor, or you can consult my guest and get all your questions answered. But we can't give free medical advice because we can't pay our bills with that, but we can help to educate you a bit and allow you to think a little bit, and always reach out to your medical professional before making any lifestyle changes. Thank you. Hello, and welcome back to the Life's Best Medicine podcast. Today, I've got a great guest who's kind enough to come back. Most people don't want to talk to me twice. Once is enough for most people in their lifetime. But Martha Carlin from BiotiQuest, thank you so much for joining me. You're having some great products, and it's really an area of medicine that I really paid no attention to for 18 years. So you're doing some important work, and you kind of by necessity, and everyone go back and listen to her previous episode when we talk about what got her motivated into looking at the gut microbiome and Parkinson's disease, and how this is now applying to other disease processes. And so Martha, welcome. Good to have you.
Thanks for having me back.
And I'm excited that you have a study that is just finishing up, and I would love to hear what you're seeing in your study, and I would love to compare that to what I'm seeing in my patients right now.
Sure. So we just are wrapping up our clinical trial. We had 30 subjects taking our sugar shift product, which alters glucose and fructose metabolism, and 30 subjects on a placebo, if you will, or which was inulin. So the control was on inulin. We have some early data. We don't have the final data. One of the interesting things in the first round of data that came back was that it also had some impact lowering triglycerides, but the first month's data, this is a 90-day trial, and the first month's data came back. There was a 10-point drop in fasting blood glucose and a 15-point drop in postprandial blood glucose in the subjects on the sugar shift product, and in the control group, there was a 10-point increase in blood glucose in the group on inulin and no change in postprandial, which was pretty interesting. So we're anxious to get the rest of the data out of that. We are also doing microbiome analysis, and we'll be doing a measurement of serum LPS. But we actually did our clinical trial in Cuba. My chief scientific officer was born in Cuba, and we did a collaboration with a hospital there. So there are some additional logistics for some of the samples, getting them to the United States. So we're sort of working through that. But the early results are really quite interesting. But out of the group that's taking sugar shift, there's a small, I think it's 3 people who are taking metformin, And they didn't have the same results as the people who were not on metformin. So I think just looking at how metformin works, the mechanism of action, and I think it works on glucagon, that there may be some, like they're at cross purposes of the mechanisms of action. I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And, you know, I mean, one question I have for you before I forget, because my patients will yell at me. So if people are fasting, is it okay to take sugar shift, or is it less effective on days if they're fasting, or if they say a lot of people don't eat breakfast? Because I just take it when I wake up in the morning, and I take it before I go to bed. I take it twice a day now because I'm an insulin resistant person. So is there any, you know, scientific reason why they have to take it with meals or after meals, or, you know, on an empty stomach? Does it really matter?
Well, you know, it is working on the food that you eat. So we do, you know, have our customers report to us that they have the best results if they are taking it with or around when they're eating food. But I think, you know, that's people who are eating more carbohydrates. So I think on the low carb side, at least for me personally, I have the best results when I take it in the evening after I've eaten. And that sort of started out because I kept forgetting to take it with my evening meal. And so I would take it maybe an hour or two before bedtime. And I noticed if I didn't take it an hour or two before bedtime, my numbers would be a little higher in the morning. So, and that really happened after, say, like 4 months on the low carb diet and more fasting. So, you know, I think it does take a little bit of tweaking for somebody who's fasting and trying to understand how their body reacts to it. And, you know, some of the stuff I've read on intermittent fasting is, you know, microbes are food. So you are sort of breaking a fast when you're taking microbes, because it's a working system that's actually producing some food in the body.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because, you know, in this area, as a matter of fact, I gave a talk on talking about the gut microbiome and the effect maybe that it has on mental functioning, on cravings and food. As a side, a lot of my patients have been reporting back that their food cravings have improved dramatically while taking sugar shift. By the way, everyone, I don't have any financial interest in BiotiQuest or you know, these products, but, you know, as a clinician, I'm eager to find treatments that can help in what our cause is, you know, and so a lot of people are telling me that their food cravings improved, they're not hungry all the time. And I've had several patients break through plateaus that were frustrating. One is a lady, she's 76 years old, and she was really frustrated with her plateau. She was doing great, but she plateaued for about 3 months in her weight loss. And then she started sugar shift, and it's been absolutely astounding what's happening. And my thinking as a clinician is, okay, if you're decreasing the amount of fructose and glucose absorbed, you're lowering the insulin. And I don't know if in your study you looked at insulin, but I'd be really intrigued to see data on that. But maybe in Cuba, there's logistical problems of doing that. But I'm convinced her insulin's dropping. We're gonna get a test done in the next week or so. But, you know, it's dramatic, the changes in some people.
I mean, that our customers, a lot of customers report to us kind of a loss of cravings or their ability. You know, one of the first people who did a kind of his own study over 5 months was a vegan who was trying to get into ketosis and having difficulty doing that, and also having difficulty doing intermittent fasting and being able to not be hungry until the afternoon. And he started taking it, you know, morning and evening, and he was able within a couple of weeks to just not be hungry until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So it does seem to have that effect. And, you know, we're very cautious about saying that it helps people lose weight, because, you know, people expect, okay, I'm going to take a pill and then I'm going to lose weight like this. But I think the way it works really is people stop craving, they stop snacking, they you know, those sugars are being converted and eliminated. And so it's a very gradual process, but we do have, you know, people emailing us all the time saying how they've lost weight and they love it. But
Yeah,
I'd love to do a study on that, but you know, it would have to be a longer study, a longer term study. I'd say, you know, like 4 to 6 months. And
now in your 90-day study, did you change the diet, or they were just on the standard diet that they were eating before?
they were on the standard diet they were eating before.
Yeah, so it'd be interesting to see if you know that your guy on the vegan diet who did so much better, and I think the mechanism most likely would be lowering insulin levels, because if your insulin is really high, it's hard to fast because insulin is telling your body to store energy, not break down energy. And so it is interesting. And I have a couple. We'll talk off air, but I have a couple of very interesting cases that I think sugar shift has really helped them in areas where other things weren't helping. And you know, it's good to note the interaction with that and metformin. And then the other question is berberine. A lot of people who don't want to take metformin are on berberine. And I'm wondering if there's an additive effect or whether there might be some kind of interaction where it's not as beneficial.
You know, we haven't studied that, but I know, you know, I've had my husband take berberine off and on. So, yeah, I'd have to look at the mechanism of action there, but I think it should be okay.
But we haven't looked at insulin levels yet, right?
But we haven't looked at insulin.
All right. So I may have to give you data that I'm going to have in the near future. So that'll
that
be
would
interesting.
Be awesome. Yeah.
Interesting to see. And especially we could see how much doing a low carb diet and combining it with sugar shift, how beneficial that is. Because I would think, you know, obviously if you're eating a lot of carbs, it'll probably be more, you would see more of a numbers drop than if you're doing, you know, it depends on your diet. Like if you have an overwhelming amount of sugar, it may not be able to, you know, really have an effect on lowering insulin and
right.
Yeah, these other markers that we're looking at, like A1C. And so if it's 90 days, we should be able to see A1C change, hopefully. And, you know, that will be really good.
Yep. So we will have the A1C measurements. And, you know, it's interesting. Mannitol is so it's converting glucose and fructose into mannitol. And that's a self-balancing biochemistry as well, which is reversible. But mannitol is such a interesting molecule. In that it's on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines, has a long history of, you know, safety profile. It crosses the blood-brain barrier and helps with a lot of different drug delivery. So they'll often pair it with drugs to have better efficacy. So, you know, in some ways, I wonder if it's making certain molecules that are made in the gut more bioavailable to the brain or other parts of the body. It's also one of the media that they store mitochondria in to keep them happy in research. So that was sort of an interesting you know, finding I saw. And then just the biochemistry of the production of mannitol, and in the microbes, one of the pathways is through glucose 6-phosphate. And in the process of sort of looking at all of this and people who have, you know, issues with sugars and insulin, I want to say it's like 1/6 of the global population that has some loss of function in that glucose 6-phosphate. So, you know, the concept maybe is the microbes can do that for you if you have, you know, bugs in your gut that have that functionality. If you have some dysfunction, you know, they can be doing that conversion for you.
Yeah, I think that's a huge area of research that's coming up that we're learning a lot more about. Is it's not just calories in, calories out necessarily. If your gut microbiome is not working right, if, you know, because, you know, I have anecdotal stories of patients who were thin their whole life, then they had a serious illness, went on antibiotics for a month, and then they gain a bunch of weight, or they're, you know, not feeling right, and their gut's never right again. And so there's definitely an effect without dietary change, and then they start gaining weight, and then they're hungry all the time, and then they get insulin resistant, and we start going down that road. And so, yeah, there's a lot to it we don't understand. And, you know, I'm curious as to the effect of mannitol on, you know, preserving the gut microbiome or preserving the mucus layer of the colon, because I have a lady, and it was astounding, poorly controlled diabetes, and we put her on sugar shift, and she's had eczema for 22 years. About 2 weeks in, she said, my eczema's gone. I said, what? You know, seriously? She said, no, sir. And I just checked in with her last week, still gone. And so I'm like, I don't know what the mechanism of why it worked or what happened, but she said for 22 years she was on topical steroids all the time and getting injections and doing all the stuff that wasn't helping her diabetes either. But she's so happy her skin's nice.
Well, one of the things I'd love to figure out, a study that's reasonably priced. One of the organisms that actually does the mannitol conversion is a strain of bacteria called Leuconostoc mesenteroides, and it makes what's called capsule, which is a sort of a mucus like a biofilm, but it's what I would say is maybe a healthy biofilm that could be improving or helping the gut lining that has permeability issues, that maybe that capsule is helping to restore and line the gut. But, to do something like that, you'd either have to come up with an animal model or be able to do some kind of biopsying to really see. But, maybe it's sort of an artificial mucus.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff. I mean, we don't.
That's my hypothesis on that, anyway.
So the reason you wanted to come back on, I mean, obviously, I wanted to catch up with you about the science behind the gut microbiome and sugar shift and all the stuff we're seeing. But we had Triple J on, and he triggered something in you. Tell me about that.
Sure. So he was talking about how God had worked in his life to set him on the right path, and I've had many experiences along the way that sort of tell me that I'm on the right path or set me on the right path, which I call my little winks from God, or that, the presence of the Holy Spirit in your life. And a lot of times people are like, oh, how can that be congruent with science? And so I actually have some interesting stories along the way of scientists who kind of came in to connect all these dots for me. But, it really goes all the way back to my husband, John, and I met in college, but we only dated for like one semester, and he sort of vanished. Turns out he had shingles, and his face got all messed up, and he didn't want me to see him. So he just graduated and left, and I never saw him again. And, that we were at the University of Kentucky, and 13 years later, I walked into a bar in Dallas, Texas, and he came across the room to me and was like, "Aren't you Martha Rogers from Kentucky?" And I was like, okay, so what are the odds of something like that happening? And sometimes, we talk about how we were brought together to like bring people with Parkinson's hope, and, a different sort of path forward. So anyway, we ended up getting married, and
where were you when you ran into him in the bar?
Dallas, Texas.
Yeah. Like, what's the odds of that? Like, right.
I mean,
see, those
like,
kind of
what are
things
the odds of that? Two people from, he was from Ohio, I was from Kentucky, we went to college 13 years later to walk into this same place. I mean, the odds of it, it was just miraculous. And I instantly that night, I called my girlfriend the next morning. I said, okay, you're going to think I've lost my mind, because I think I've lost my mind, but I'm going to marry him.
Wow. Is that amazing? Yeah.
And, our journey together. So that was in the mid 1990s. We got married, we had 2 children, and our children were really small when John was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and I had an older child, and our kids were like 2 and 4 years old. But sort of along the way, I was searching for answers and started studying science on the side, which I never really would have done without John being sick. And in 2008, we got invited, or not 2008, 2010, we got invited to climb Mount Kilimanjaro with a group of people, Lori Snyder, who's a big MS. She's a inspirational speaker. She has MS, and she actually put together this trip. She's the only person with MS. She climbed the 7 summits after she was diagnosed with MS, which is pretty amazing. She's an amazing person. And she put together this group called the More Than a Mountain, Our Leap of Faith. And so it was 10 people with MS, 4 people with Parkinson's, and then each person was paired with a healthy partner to climb the mountain. So, you know, we did all this training leading up to it. And I had really gotten out of shape because I worked all the time and wasn't going to the gym. And so just the process of training for that was such a great experience. But, you know, we get to Africa, and, you know, I would say I was not that conventionally religious, because I'd gotten sort of a bad taste in my mouth from, you know, some judgmental things earlier in my life. But my mother, who struggled with MS, 2 different kinds of cancer, pulmonary hypertension, lots of things, was a very faithful person all the way through her life. And, you know, I had these little books of the prayers and sayings that my mother would say. And on the way over there, you know, I was just sort of looking through one of the books that my mother kept with her. And, you know, one of her favorite sayings was that I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And so we get to the mountain, we're doing our climb. It's 6 days up, and it's like the final ascent. And you're just like struggling to breathe, struggling for every step. It's this, you know, one foot after the other sort of focus. And this phrase, you know, this mantra of my mother's, I can do all things through Christ, starts coming into my head, and I'm saying it with every step. And, you know, for a lot of my life, I've tried doing meditation and never really gotten to that state that, you know, people talk about. And it was just the first time in my life, you know, everything else falls away, and you're just in that moment of step after step. And I'm saying this, I can do all things through Christ, every step. And all of a sudden, and I'm thinking, okay, I have to make it up this mountain, because if I turn around, John won't be able to make it, and John needs to make it. And all of a sudden, like I felt the spirit of both of my parents who were deceased come beside me. It was a very emotional experience.
Yeah.
And lift my arms up and carry me up the mountain. And we actually wrote a book, all the different people who participated in that climb. 21 or 22 of the people who participated in the climb each wrote a chapter in the book. It's called More Than a Mountain, Our Leap of Faith. I think it's still available on Amazon. And so I told that story in there. And what really my lesson from that was how love survives everything. And love, you know, is what makes it possible for you to do everything. And that, you know, when I needed my parents, they came to me. And it really is true. I can do all things. So, you know, that was sort of a first step along the pathway. And I was still working in my commercial real estate world at that time. But this experience with all of these people on the Kilimanjaro journey really started having me dig even deeper beyond Parkinson's into MS, because so many of these people were, you know, became my friends. And so I was, you know, looking along those lines. Well, then I think I told on the last podcast how I ended up at a Parkinson's conference in 2016 when my husband was not doing as well. He was having some trouble walking. And these researchers from Israel had presented data on mannitol and its ability to stop the aggregation of the proteins in an animal model and actually pull them out of the brain. And so, you know, that's when I came back and came up with this formula. But at the time I came up with the formula, you know, every weekend when we would go to church, or it seemed like every weekend for like 2 months, there was some topic in the sermon on the manna in the desert. And I'm like, okay, so I start sort of digging down this rabbit hole of looking at the passages, and I wasn't really a Bible scholar or anything like that, but just looking at the passages in the Bible about manna. And of course, the term mannitol comes from manna. It's like God's food, which if you start digging into some of the research and the history around how people have talked about that, it certainly sounds like a molecule of a, some type of like it came from moisture in the air and then dried, which is kind of funny because that's, you freeze dry a lot of these probiotics and stuff. But so, that was sort of an interesting piece of the puzzle. And then I also go back to the beginning of starting my company, and, just trying to think, how can I help John heal? Because I do believe that he can heal. And, I don't talk about this a lot, but I started waking up in the middle of the night at the exact same time every night. And this went on for about a year. And I think maybe after 3 or 4 months, of waking up, looking at the clock at the same time, I was like, okay, so what is this about? Like, what's my message? And it was 11 something at night. I don't remember the exact chapter, but I said, well, okay, it's about John because John's my husband. So I went to the Gospel of John, and it's the chapter about Lazarus being raised from the dead. And in that particular passage, Martha is the only one who believes that Jesus can raise him from the dead. I was like, okay, this is your message that, if you believe, this can really happen. John can be healed. So that was going on. And then once I sort of got that message, I started waking up at another like 4 o'clock something. And so then I was like, okay, I'm going to go look at John again. And that was Jesus and the woman at the well, and talking about living water. And so I'm like, okay, what is this about? I start sort of digging into trying to figure out what is living water. Well, on the science side, I was digging very deeply into the mitochondria and metabolic water, the production of metabolic water, which is what happens when you fast also. And I was like, well, maybe the living water, because there's another place somewhere in the Bible where it talks about like water welling up in your belly or something. I can't remember what. I was like, well, maybe that's somehow connected to this. And I have a friend who's a rabbi in Israel who contacted me when I first started the company. And he connected me with a biochemist at UCLA who was working in pediatric cancer. And so I had been communicating back and forth with him, and somehow this subject came up, and he goes, oh, I have a YouTube video on living water and the mitochondria and Jesus at the well. And I was like, okay, a scientist?
Yeah, it's pretty wild, because a lot of people think you need to just, like, if you're a scientist, you can't have faith. If you have faith, you can't be a scientist. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive. In my experience, being a doctor, I mean, I see miracles. I'm like, I can't explain it, but I'll take it. I'm okay with that. With good outcomes.
It was so interesting because then we started this kind of interesting conversation over email between the rabbi and the scientist and me about, like, he was asking the rabbi for scientific interpretations of, what the separation of the firmaments and whether or not that was related to cellular membranes. And like, it's interesting too, because if you look at Aramaic and Hebrew languages, there's like layers of meaning and understanding. And so some of the work they were doing was really trying to peel back, is there actually scientific understanding and meaning there that's been missed because of the complexity of the language. So this is just kind of really interesting, and some people would say sort of crazy stuff. But I also tell people, like, I wasn't a scientist by training. I've taught myself all of this because of my interest in trying to save John. And, I've studied across many fields of science, and I can connect a lot of dots because, I've looked at these different areas, but like I feel divinely guided a lot of times. I'll order a science book that's 2 inches thick and it comes to the house and I open the page and it's actually the page I need. So like, I believe that there is some guidance and element of faith in what I'm doing, because I want to help people. And, my interest and everything I do is motivated by my love for John, and now for everybody else, just hearing from people that I'm helping. Like my days are just filled with giggles and grins, hearing from people and knowing that I'm helping.
Yeah, that's a huge thing. And I think a lot of your products, that's why I look, oh, Simple Slumber. I'm like, oh, I like that. A probiotic that you can use to help you sleep, get your serotonin levels right and melatonin levels. And, so it's really like, and those things affect lives. I mean, it all ties together. If you can have the best diet in the world, but if you're a jerk to everyone and you hate the world and you're bitter all the time, you don't smile, you're not gonna have the same benefits if you're stressed all the time and it's drudgery, one step at a time. But looking for going towards that goal, sometimes you say you're gonna go through a hard time, but it's gonna be worth it in the end, but that one step at a time, I could do all things through Christ, right? All those things that keep you going, like, and the metaphor to your life is I think this is a valid question, being hurt by the church, being hurt by judgmental people, all those things, which is a very common theme, obviously, in the world, right? That's why a lot of people aren't going to listen to my podcast, because they don't want to hear it. But when you go through hard times, like when you go through, getting your husband diagnosed at 44, all the things that go through your mind are like, okay, God, like, why are you throwing this on my plate right now? Those kind of questions.
Well, my husband was very angry at God for a long time. And, I think really working through and trying to get at peace with that and not be angry with God has been a big step in the direction of his healing as well. Because if you're just constantly carrying this anger, it's hard to be at peace. And I mean, Parkinson's is an interesting disease because there's definitely an underlying physical manifestation of like fear, this emotional, there's some evidence that there may have been like a trauma or something that sort of flips on the fight or flight that can't get turned off. I think some of that could be chemical from what's going on in the microbiome, but it could also be, something that physically happened. But, starting to work on that part of being at peace, at peace with what's going on, being at peace and not fearful about what lies ahead, is also kind of a part of being able to heal yourself and do better. And that, the body does have amazing capability to heal itself, but there's so many layers to what's going on. And Parkinson's is a very complex disease. John sometimes calls it the designer disease because, every person has a slightly different manifestation of the symptoms. And what's interesting about that is you can sort of lay out the microbes and look at, what are the various symptoms of an acute infection from this or this or this or this, and sort of overlay that into the complexity of the symptomology of Parkinson's.
Yeah, because I see some people have a lot of physical manifestations, or some people, it's just hard when they want to walk, to get started going, and other people, it's memory or facial expressions. There's so many things, eye contact, and just kind of a blank stare, things like that. And it's such a hard disease to deal with. I mean, because you're losing control of your body. daily, sometimes, and so, not knowing the progression, it's so, because I think ultimately a lot of us fear just being a burden to other people, where they have to, carry us and help us and do things. It's like, I don't want to be a burden. It's really a hard thing when you're facing a chronic progressive disease, and you go, do I just lay down? Like, some people get diagnosed with cancer and they fall up the tent and they're done. Other people, I'm fighting this one step at a time. I'm going to do what I can, up to a certain point, and so, how is that for you? Like with John, is it like, has he ever said, forget it, it's not worth going through all this stuff to try to?
No, in fact, he sort of chuckles. He goes, I'm lab rat number one. But he often says, just from his experience in working in the Parkinson's community, and he's been very active with bringing exercise and cycling into the Parkinson's community. But what he typically finds is there's sort of that 80-20 rule that you find, people get a diagnosis and 80% of the people are just listening to that. Okay, this is what you have. Here's a pill. It's not going to there's nothing you can do to make a difference. And then there's this 20%, which is the community we're really active with, of people with Parkinson's who are, looking at exercise, looking at diet, looking at, things like Tai Chi and energy medicine and, different ways to support the overall system to do better. And, those are the people that we see really doing the best. And the people who are afraid to try these other things or sort of step out of the conventional box are the ones that just say, okay, I'm going to go sit down over here and it's just not going to get any better. And we've seen over the years, John's had ups and downs. I can't say it's like, it hasn't been a perfect cup of tea. And actually, I just wrote a blog post on my Martha's Quest Parkinson's blog about John and COVID, because we both had COVID in December. And he had a much more severe case and has some of the, long COVID tail, if you will. And so it's been a struggle for us to get back to where, he was before December because of, just collateral damage from having COVID.
It's hard when you don't have that resiliency, and if your gut microbiome is already hurting and you're trying to fix it, then you take antibiotics to get over an illness, or and then you could get set back. And yeah, it's hard. Have you ever crossed paths with Dr. Hazan by any chance? Sabine Hazan?
Yes, actually, we are sort of in the queue. So she's working on doing fecal transplants for Parkinson's, but we've actually done a preliminary analysis, and John has C. diff. So there's a possibility, because he has C. diff, that he could have a fecal transplant. And so I was in California last week, and we were trying to get scheduled so that I could go in to be evaluated for a donor. What's one of the interesting things about her research is, so she's shown that people who have low bifidobacteria are at greater risk of COVID and poor outcomes of COVID. And low bifidobacteria has also been an indicator in some of the other diseases she's treated with fecal transplants. People with Parkinson's also have low bifidobacteria, but, I started digging in, just trying to think about, am I going to be a good donor for him? So I've been on the ketogenic diet for 6 months now, and a ketogenic diet actually lowers bifidobacteria. So I've been trying to think, okay, how can I boost my bifidobacteria? But bifidobacteria actually increases, I think it's TH17 or so. It's one of the cytokines. And so I think it may have some signaling ability of sort of at the front end, but maybe at the back end, if it gets turned on and you can't turn it off, is not great. I don't know, but her work is super interesting.
Yeah, it's so complicated, because I think we're probably going to find that there's more of a balance. Like if you have too much bifido, you get in trouble. You get too little, you get in trouble. So how do you get into that sweet spot, because we're seeing data released now, just yesterday, as a matter of fact, and it's one of those things where, what was it? I hate to say I was right or something like that. I hate to say I told you so, but Tro and I were seeing in our practice that people on a low carb ketogenic diet, where their mood was getting better, their anxiety was better, their bipolar was stabilizing, things were getting better. And if you're a stress eater and you get the stress better, guess what? They let stress eat less. So we were observing this as, hey, we don't know the mechanism, but this is what we're both seeing. And we got attacked like mercilessly by doctors saying you guys should have your license revoked. This is a quote, a direct quote. You should have your license revoked for even discussing that this would have anything to do with mood. And what's great is a big study just came out, and they're showing a huge, 43% of people came off all meds. I think 100% of people lost weight and felt better, and and remission of refractory depression, and so it's Georgia Ede was one of the authors, and Dr. Westman. And so you start looking at this saying, well, there's a lot we don't understand, but I think part of it is, my mentality was always, okay, if we get the insulin level right, then everything else gets better. But there's a lot more to the story, because you're eating a lot of bad foods, then you're putting bad stuff, you're messing up your gut microbiome also, alcohol and maybe artificial, whatever it is. And it's our job to kind of figure this out at some point. But like I said, one of the head people in low carb, when I started discussing the gut microbiome, they said, hey, you can't talk about this. They pulled me aside separately and said, you can't talk about this stuff. You got to just stick to the science. I was like, there's a ton of science. I've looked at all the studies on this. There's a lot of science behind this, so it's amazing. Just because people don't look at the science doesn't mean it's not there.
Well, the other thing I would say, like when I look at a lot of the animal studies, so there's I think a misconception of sort of marrying the high fat diet in an animal model with ketogenic, and it's not the same. You really have to look at what fats the animals are being fed, and they're not necessarily being fed healthy fats.
Yeah, they're using vegetable oils and seed oils and all kinds of bad stuff that we know are going to, everyone agrees they cause a problem. Not everyone agrees, but a lot of us agree.
All of our cell membranes require lipids. And, I was actually just reading some stuff yesterday about bioactive lipid compounds. So, if you're low fat and you're not getting any of these lipids that are critical, for fat soluble vitamin production and that sort of thing, it just logically doesn't seem that it would be good not to eat fat.
Yeah, and that's a hard thing. And I think that's, it's such a hard thing for all of us, because we've been, since childhood, to say, if you eat fat, you're going to die of a heart attack. And it's really hard because we haven't really made that connection. As a matter of fact, there's some ongoing studies right now where a cholesterol skeptic doc is eating 2 sticks of butter to prove that it's going to screw up his cholesterol, and his HDL went way up and his LDL went up a little bit. So you start looking and say, that's 2 sticks of butter a day. Most people aren't doing that, but you go to an extreme to try to prove your point. And then he went radio silent, it looks like, because the results are not what he expected. But I think that's what science is about.
Butter also has a lot of butyrate. So, and butyrate is a signaling molecule that, helps restore the gut lining. That's actually one of the things our probiotic does, is help increase the genes for butyrate production. But it's kind of funny. My youngest niece, when she was little, they used to catch her sitting in the closet eating a stick of butter when she was like, I don't know, 4 or 5 years old. And I'm thinking, now that I know all this stuff, I'm like, well, her body was probably telling her, you need butyrate.
Yeah.
Or you need fat. And, she was in there eating a stick of butter, but I've always been a butter lover. So, even when everybody was low fat, I was still like cooking with lots of butter. And maybe that's why I have a totally different microbiome than John.
Yes, I think that's going to be an interesting, it's interesting finding to see about the fecal transplants. And, I've been blown away by the science and just talking about clinical experience with people who've done it. And it's amazing. It is just amazing. Like, Dr.
Well, we actually, so back at the very beginning, when we first made the product for John, we were measuring his microbiome. He's probably had his microbiome sequenced more than 99% of the people on the planet. And we were testing him for 120 days. I mean, not every day, but over 120-day period doing whole genome sequencing while he was taking sugar shift and seeing how it was moving back to a healthier microbiome profile. But then we talked about this on the last podcast, where we identified that he had the intercellular parasite Toxoplasma gondii, and we gave him, he took a 6-week course of Bactrim, and we saw the diversity and everything in his microbiome just zapped, just like went away, except for, this one ugly bug, Porphyromonas, that dropped a little bit, but not that much. And so, we're like, okay, we've done all this good work and now it's all wiped out. And we did a fecal transplant. And what we saw from the fecal transplant, so we had somebody that we screened, and we saw the bounce back to where he was before, but just much faster. Because if you think about, like, you're modulating with a probiotic of, ours is 8 strains, and it's sort of changing the ecosystem and the environment gradually over time. But if you're putting in a fecal transplant, you're putting in like a whole system. I think, the tougher thing, there's a fellow by the name of Tom Borody, who's been like really one of the pioneers in fecal transplants, and Dr. Hazan works with him a lot on things. He's done a pretty good percentage of people with Parkinson's, and he has varying degree of success, some really high level of success and some not so much. And, I think part of that is because whatever microbiome you have established, and probably the diet that you're continuing to feed it, is going to have a big impact on that. So, what's the balance of trying to get rid of the problems that are in there and restore it with a healthy working microbiome? I mean, it's a really interesting area. And I think we're starting to see more and more companies, either focused on fecal transplants or how to put together like much larger groups of that would sort of mimic a fecal transplant.
Yeah, and the other thing, and just for people listening, what do you recommend? Like, there's so many probiotics out there. There's so many people are taking the same probiotic for 10 years. Is there at some point diminishing returns, or some of these things? I know some of the products on the market aren't great. It's more marketing and making a buck. Is there ever a problem? Like, for instance, if I'm doing Simply Slumber at night, I'm doing this for this, I'm doing the heart health one, and the immune stuff. Is there at some point like, don't take them all at once, take one at a time, cycle them? Anything like you would recommend?
I do tell people, especially with ours, it's a working system. So you don't want to take like 3 of them at the same time, because this system might interfere with this system. So I typically tell people, if they're going to take more than one product, to take them an hour or 2 apart. Take your Simple Slumber right before bed, and sugar shift with your last meal or around that. I do think it's a good idea to give your gut a break, and look at products that have some science behind them, that have, actually one of the ones I like, I don't know how this guy does his supply chain, because it takes him 3 to 5 years, I think, to make his product. I think it's called Dr. O'Hara's or something. It's a really complex, long fermentation that he does. And it's a pretty expensive product, but that's a really interesting product because of the postbiotics that are produced by it. And I think we're also starting to see more work in what's called the postbiotic field, which is, basically the metabolites that are produced by the bacteria. And so if you ferment them for a very long time, you can come out the other end with not that many live organisms, but all the molecules that they have produced in the fermentation process. And so I think we'll begin to see more and more research on that. And we're actually working with another scientist who has a product called Delimune, which is basically lysed bacteria. They use an enzymatic process to lyse the bacteria. And so you have all the cell wall components and all the enzymes and everything that was inside the organism, and those are, bioactive compounds. And so we're looking at how we might do that with some of our strains of bacteria, because we know, different peptide sequences of the cell walls are something called muramyl peptides, which have immunomodulatory effects. So, I do think it's a sort of, back to your question, it's a good idea to take a break or to rotate, but you don't want to take 6 probiotics all at the same time, because they interfere with each other. And we did some work with our BioFlux computational model for some other brands early on, and basically showed them if you haven't put together a working system, you can actually put together a bunch of organisms that are counterproductive and really leave you with only one organism in the end.
Yeah, I think it's really, it's really interesting, all this science. I think we're gonna, like, when we get back together in a year or so, we'll have a lot more information and say, okay, here's what works. But are there any things that you say, okay, there's a good idea to do, like, kimchi or sauerkraut or, apple cider vinegar?
I tell people all the time, kimchi and sauerkraut, fermented foods, unless, there are people who, and I think this is more people with SIBO, who have a high level of FODMAP sensitivity or some of the histamine sensitivity. Those fermented foods can be a problem for them. But like some of the strains of bacteria in our formulas were isolated from fermented foods. So like there's people in Australia or places where it's very expensive to ship our product. And I tell them, they could buy 1 bottle and make yogurt with it, and then continue to use that yogurt culture, or they can, the thing about fermented foods is they are a working system. Through the fermentation process, you've got that, working sort of teamwork of the organisms in the fermentation. And, many of the sauerkraut organisms are really what's the base for our patent and our formula.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing stuff. And it's actually interesting too. And this may be something, the bifidobacteria, I had never heard that a ketogenic diet can decrease them. Right.
Yeah. I just started kind of digging into it because, Sabine had all this data and research around bifidobacteria, and I haven't tested mine probably in, I don't know, it's probably been 3 years since I've tested mine. I actually went through a lot of the same sort of testing that John was doing, looking at mine. And I did this, I'll say it's an experiment, because there was all the craze about fibers. And so I started drinking this super duper fiber shake of like 7 different kinds of fiber every morning. But what happened over the course of 7 months was this one organism in my gut just like took over. It went from like 3% relative abundance to 37% relative abundance. And I thought, okay, that's not a good thing when you lack diversity to that degree. So I sort of stepped back my overdoing but, I did have bifidobacteria definitely in my, and then there's also prebiotics that are specific to bifidobacteria. So there's something called XOS, xylo-oligosaccharide, that specifically feeds bifidobacteria. So you can look at, there's a company called Prenexus that makes an XOS. So you can find a probiotic that is just a bifidobacteria, say a bifidolongum, and, take XOS with it to sort of support that bifidobacteria. There's also, I tell a lot of new mothers who ask me about probiotics. There's a company out of UC Davis that makes a product called Evivo, and it all the research showed that, babies in the Western world had lost this specific bifidobacteria that was protective in the gut and sort of training the immune system and doing all this work. And they were able to isolate and bring that strain of bacteria to the market. And it's fed by human milk oligosaccharides, so obviously much better if you're breastfeeding your baby. But there's a new company out called Origins, I think, that actually makes a prebiotic similar to human milk oligosaccharides for adults. And so there are ways to support your bifidobacteria, but
Yeah, and Acromancy is another one that I heard, like if you're doing strict carnivore for a long time, and this can start eating your own mucus because you starve it of sugar. I think Dr. Davis talked about that. So it's really interesting that the long term, when you start saying, oh, things are starting to not go right, let's look at different factors that may be involved.
Yeah, well, Acromancy is actually, it's interesting because it is a mucin degrader, and it is elevated in people with Parkinson's and MS. So is that the microbiome trying to protect, or is it a signal of inflammation? Really what's going on there? And, I talk a lot about how the microbiome is sort of a key to the razor's edge of balance, because, certain molecules that are made can increase the risk of cancer. But on the other side of that is neurological disease. So you want to be sort of right down the middle path, the straight path, where it's not too much on one side or the other side, because, one is cancer and the other is neurological problems. So, all balance in all things.
Well, and I think when I look at this, and the more I step back, and when people say, it's funny because I have friends that go, you're a doctor and you look at the human body and all this stuff you study of meds and all these things, and how could you believe in a God? And I said, how can you look at the complexity of just the human hand or just the microbiome and how fragile we really are if things get out of whack, right? And amazingly how, if we get the toxins and the bad stuff out of the way, we have a huge capability of healing. And even just dealing with stress and sleep deprivation and, all these things. And it's amazing to me that we can't say, it's pretty unlikely that two pieces of dirt rub together and all of a sudden we have this complex organism. Generally in life, what we see is, mountains break down to rocks and then that breaks down to sand. You don't see it going the opposite way. And then all of a sudden you're forming a car out of nothing. Someone had to create that car. So that's one of those things that's very interesting. And the more we learn, the more we realize how much we really don't know.
Well, one of the early books in reading as I was teaching myself science, I read Dr. Francis Collins, who used to be the head of NIH. He has a book called The Language of God. And he was an atheist when he started out the Human Genome Project. And that book is his story about, coming to the conclusion through that process that there was a God, because of the perfection of the human genome. So, even the head of the NIH wrote a book about it. So I think we're coming to a point where people can start to see, sort of these common ground between, science and God, and that they aren't really diametrically opposed to each other.
No, I think that when you combine the two, I think it's pretty powerful. When you say, hey, look, there's stuff I can't explain. Here's what we're seeing. Here it is. Okay, we'll figure it out later, maybe. But as long as we're helping people, and I know that's your drive, and that's why I wanted to have you back on too. You're going through struggles like that with having a husband diagnosed at a young age at a disease when you think, I'm going to be a widow in a few years, all those things. And all these years later, you two are still fighting the fight, not giving up, one step at a time. Because you guys said, I'm not doing anything about it. And then you don't help other people with Sugar Shift and all these other products you're coming out with that are, sometimes these bad things happen and then good comes out of it for a lot of other people.
That's so true. And I feel that I'm just blessed every day, even though we have this challenge, I'm blessed with the path that it's put me on, with all the people that I've come in contact through the process of, exploring and learning. And, it's been an amazing journey, and I'm looking forward to what unfolds ahead.
Yeah. So I got to ask you again, what's life's best medicine for you right now? Maybe it's different than last time.
I think life's best medicine is love. And I was reminded of that telling you my Kilimanjaro story, because it really does survive everything.
That's true. I think that's really important, and to feel that presence, and to feel, then that's something, it's hard because people who haven't experienced it, you can't really explain it, like what you felt at that moment, to feel your parents' presence, to feel God's presence, and to be in the Holy Spirit, as you say. And it's such a foreign concept for people, but those who've experienced, like, it's kind of like with low carb, we say, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you felt it, and you go, okay, I know, no matter what like, no one can tell you what you experienced wasn't real.
Right.
Like I say, scientifically, okay, I'll explain what happened. It was the neurons doing this, and so that's what I wanted, is people like you who are very smart, who've accomplished a lot in life, who are scientific, to say, yeah, okay, I still believe. Because that's the problem I got into with on my old podcast with them, still on Low Carb MD. Is if I talked about faith or hope and saying, hey, look, kind of like what you were saying, I was saying, in the middle of COVID, I said, things will get better. Just wait. It is better now than it was back then. It was terrible back then. People are going to go on the beach by themselves, So things do get better. This too shall pass. And you kind of just take one step at a time and don't give up hope, and say, hopefully, I believe that maybe I'm wrong, but I'm always going to believe things are going to get better.
Well, what's interesting, like before we started the call, I was talking about how the placebo effect is really belief. And there's a scientist, Bruce Lipton, who's written a book called The Biology of Belief, and done a lot of scientific research about how belief impacts our, like everything, but ultimately our course of health and disease.
Yeah, and outcomes. There's surgeons, if they'll ask the patient, do you think this knee replacement is going to help you? And if they say no, they'll say cancel the surgery. Cancel the surgery, because it's really something that the mind is very powerful.
Well, and then back to sort of other sciencey people, or medical professionals. Ben Carson, I think his book that I read was called The Hands of God, and he talked about how, like, sometimes he just like felt the presence of the Holy Spirit kind of moving his hands during the surgery. And people think that sounds crazy, but if you've experienced anything like, being guided, it's really not crazy.
Yeah, once you see it, it's not crazy. And you look at what he's accomplished and what he's done with his life. I actually met him briefly when he came and spoke at USC years ago. And it was just amazing, that his mindset and how he views life. And, we need more people like that are willing to say, hey, look, here's how I see it. I'm a neurosurgeon, which is, they say it's not brain surgery, but in his case it is. And, and to be humble and to be kind and to help people. And, it's amazing when you see, when you're motivated by love, when you want to help people, and people see that. They know if you have to make a buck or if you really care or not. And, I think it's important that, companies like you and people like you help people, and that's why I like to have a platform view, so people who may benefit from what you're doing can look into it, at least try it. If it doesn't work, then go on to something else, right? Yeah. And so, if it's not causing a lot of side effects and problems and dangers, then you say, okay, I want to help people. And so how do people track you down?
So you can track me down the two primary ways. BiotiQuest, it's www.biotiquest.com. That's our website for all our products and brands. And Martha's Quest is my Parkinson's blog, and that's just, Martha's no apostrophe quest. And I write a lot on the Martha's Quest blog about, different alternative therapies in Parkinson's, and I do an update. I was trying to do it quarterly, but it's hard to keep up with. I do a couple of times a year a microbiome update, because there's so much research coming out on Parkinson's and the microbiome, and just other dietary vitamins, supplements, things that, research. And there, I'd pull the research in and show people, where they can go for a deeper look at the science behind how something might be helping in Parkinson's.
Awesome. Keep up the good work. I'm looking forward to the next time we talk. And thank you for sharing. I know it's hard to share faith stuff and life journeys and all that kind of stuff. It's awkward publicly sometimes, but I find that, people like you come out, then someone is going to be triggered by what you said. Say, hey, I want to talk about my experience too now. Okay. Because, having some courage and just saying, here's how I see it. This is my life. I'm not trying to push on you, but this is what's happened to me.
Right.
So keep up the good work and thank you. I mean, really, I'm using your products a lot with my patients. I'm having some great success. So I appreciate what you're doing. And hopefully we just keep pushing the science forward and figuring this thing out.
Well, thanks for having me back to tell more of the rest of the story.
No, I appreciate it. Everyone, hey, love, it's really about love. Be kind to yourself, be kind to others. And, if you can help someone, do it. If you have something on your brain, listen. And I think the funny thing in listening to you, Martha, too, is a lot of times I'll be woken up at 2 or 3 in the morning with some revelation or some idea of saying, you should do this, you need to call this person, whatever it was. And I was thinking, God, why is it that you wake me up at 2 or 3 in the morning all the time? And he says, well, you're too distracted all the other times. As soon as you wake up, you're distracted by life. I was like, wow, okay. So sometimes just going for that. And there's data on that, just going for a hike or a walk or getting out and just meditating or praying or whatever you're doing, that may help that breakthrough you're looking for. Just taking a breath for a minute and not just being on constant overdrive and overstimulated all the time. And, sometimes just being is good.
Well, I used to get this message over and over in my head that was, in the silence, you will find the answers. So
we'll end with that.
Yeah.
Be silent sometimes, guys. All right. Thanks, Martha. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode. We greatly appreciate your support. We would greatly appreciate a positive thumbs up on all of the platforms like iTunes and Spotify or wherever you're listening. And we just thank you for our Patreon supporters. We greatly appreciate your help in getting this message out. We think there's a lot of important information. And hopefully this helps you. Have a great day. And thank you for listening. And thank you for your support.